Can you hear me? No? I am not Jhumpa Lahiri. I am Ombretta Frau, a professor of Italian at Holyoke College, and I'm very happy to welcome you tonight. Benvenuti e buonasera a tutti. Tonight's event will be in two parts. First, there is a conversation and reading with Jhumpa Lahiri, which will be followed by questions from you. I will have to ask you to refrain from using phones and other electronic devices to take photos, record, film this event. Whatever you have, watches, phones, iPads, computers, and other things that I'm not aware they exist. The event will be filmed by Holyoke College. So thank you all for your collaborations. After the event, there will also be books for sale from the Odyssey bookstore. Jhumpa Lahiri, as you probably know, pre-signed 100 copies. And students can charge their one card. Before we welcome our very special guest, I would like to acknowledge everyone who made this event possible. First of all, my colleagues in the Italian program at Holyoke, Erika Moretti and Morena Svaldi. Another colleague who's here in spirit, we hope, is Valentine Giamatti. One of our sponsors tonight is the Valentine Giamatti Italian Fund. We credit Professor Giamatti for bringing the study of Italian language, culture, and literature to Holyoke in full force in 1940. He met his wife, a Smith student, while they were both studying in Florence, she in the junior year abroad, and he, a graduate student at Yale. Later, they moved to Holyoke, where Professor Giamatti, an avid book and antique collector, spent his career. One of their children, Angelo Bartlett Bart Giamatti, later became president of Yale and baseball commissioner. He was actor Paul Giamatti's father. Please visit our website for some great photographs of Professor Giamatti at Holyoke. Every year, the Italian program hosts a Giamatti-sponsored event. Over the years, we had many distinguished guests. One of them is here tonight, and is my predecessor, Professor Mazzocco. And in recent years, as many of you know, we hosted journalists Lucia Annunziata, authors Dacia Maraini, and Carmine Abate as well. Tonight's event was also made possible by the generous contribution of our president, Lynn Pasquarella, our Dean of the College, Siri Banks, the McCulloch Center for Global Initiatives, and the Weizmann Center for Leadership. And finally, I would like to thank our volunteers, Sally and Camille, and all of the students of the South Asian Student Association of Holyoke College for their generosity and availability. Thank you. Jhumpa Lahiri is one of those people who truly need no introduction. A professor of creative writing at Princeton University, she holds a BA from a sister college, Barnard, and 2 MAs, an MFA, and a PhD in Renaissance Studies from Boston University. She is the recipient of many honors, among them the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for her debut book, Interpreter of Maladies, and a National Humanities Medal, which she received from President Obama last September. I will mention one more honor, something that made Jhumpa very happy, a laurea honoris causa from the University of Siena in 2015. The book that we will discuss together tonight also won the Premio Internazionale Viareggio Versilia in Italy. Interpreter of Maladies, her debut story collection that explores issues of love and identity among immigrants and cultural transplants, was written with a compelling universal fluency and was followed by her first novel, The Namesake, in 2003. The Namesake expands on the perplexity of the immigrant experience and the search for identity. A film version of The Namesake, directed by Mira Nair, was released in 2007. In 2008, Lahiri published another volume of short stories, Unaccustomed Earth. And in 2013, her novel, The Lowland, a finalist for both the Man Booker Prize and the National Book Award in Fiction. One of the most intellectually elegant novelists in the world, according to the Washington Post, Lahiri's writing has been praised for its timeless, engaging, universal qualities. The editors of the volume naming Jhumpa Lahiri Canons and Controversies, Lavina Dhingra and Floyd Chung, write in their introduction that, and I quote, readers of Lahiri's fiction are often captivated not only by her engaging realist writing style, but also by her uncanny renderings of seemingly universal human events with which many can identify, such as marital harmony, leaving home for college, rebelling against one's parents, falling in love, rejecting or choosing a name, losing a spouse or a parent to death, being pregnant, being a parent, and the evolving, often bittersweet relations between husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, long-lost lovers, end of quote. Something important happened in Jhumpa Lahiri's life in 2012. She decided to move her family, husband, and 2 young children to Rome, where they spent the next 3 years and where they continue to spend significant periods of time. This was not a sudden decision, but rather a meditated one, a decision that required reflection and study. For months before her move, Lahiri stopped reading in English altogether to concentrate only on her Italian. Students, take notice. Her experience in Rome was transformative. The result is her first non-fiction book, In altre parole, in other words, that she wrote in Italian and published in Italy in 2014. This book, now available in English translation as well, is going to be the basis of our conversation tonight. So finally, let us welcome Jhumpa Lahiri at Holyoke College. Prego. Benvenuta. Grazie. È acceso? Grazie. Ah, si sente?
Buonasera.
Sì. Oh, can you hear? So, I'm sorry. Benvenuta, Jhumpa. In altre parole is already a best-selling title, so congratulations. This book surprised many of your readers, and perhaps it surprised you as well. You are a very accomplished author. Your first books are classics. They're read in colleges, they're analyzed, they're quoted. You could have had a very comfortable life as a famous writer, to continue to write books that in a way reproduce situations and characters and the language of your other books. And instead, you decided on this bold move with a book that, aside from being written in Italian, is utterly different from anything you published so far. So to begin with, to begin with, this is a deeply personal and honest piece of writing for all of you who read it already. Can you tell us about this journey, about your fear and your courage to do this?
Certainly. Before I begin, I would just like to say thank you all for coming, and thank you to Mount Holyoke, to the department, and to the Giamatti Fund, and most of all to Ombretta for inviting me tonight. We've been planning this evening for almost 2 years, yes. And I'm really happy that it's happening.
Thank you.
So, how can I explain? I mean, this was a book I had to write. Like every book that I've written, it comes out of a need, right? To be written, to be thought through, to be expressed, to be created. And And so in that sense, it's like any other book, but as you say, it's unlike the preceding books. Being comfortable doesn't interest me from a creative point of view. And I think, though I'm very grateful for the good fortune I've had, as a writer, I certainly didn't expect it. I don't think anybody does, but I didn't. And so I'm grateful for it. But I also feel very strongly that success is not necessarily propitious, right, for the artist. And I think many creative people would agree with this. I was very struck by something that the Chilean painter Fernando Botero said. This is in Italian, but I can translate it. The artist doesn't master his own craft, and he doesn't know exactly what he wants to express. He lives in a state of continuous anguish, di angoscia permanente. And so I think that my path in Italian is now the source of this permanent anguish, creative anguish, right? And it's a very powerful thing because, as I explain in the book, it's the whole book is born from it has at its heart a series of contradictions, which we can talk about. But I think the central one is the idea that why this search for a new language? Why the determination in the middle of my life, I hope, to find another language and to somehow have a relationship with it. I won't say make it mine, because I don't feel like Italian will ever be mine, but that's sort of the beauty of it, right? But to have a relationship with it, nevertheless, as a writer, not just as a person, as a speaker, but as a writer, as a thinker. So it's born out of a desire to have a relationship with a language. And why is that? Because when I moved to Rome, I had, as you explained to everyone, I'd studied Italian for about 20 years in a very discontinuous way in the United States, off and on, having periods of intensity and then, long pauses, and then eventually it just began to have a more steady focus, and then we moved there, and I was able to speak Italian. It wasn't not the way I speak it now, but I spoke it pretty well, and so I would find myself in situations, meeting people, dinners, whatever, and people kept asking me, well, why do you speak Italian? And I said, well, I don't know, because I love it, because I wanted to, because I have to, but none of the answers were ever very convincing, because everybody kept saying, well, but is your husband Italian? No. Well, do you work with Italians? No. Have you ever lived in Italy? No. Did you do a junior abroad? No. No, none of the above. And so, everyone, sono rimasti stupiti. They were all sort of like, well, what's going on here? And so, and their questions triggered these questions for me. And I started to ask myself, well, why am I having this incredibly intense relationship with a language that, in theory, I didn't need to pursue? And so the book grows out of that, and then it grows out of this contradiction of wanting so strongly to connect to a language that I can't ever really fully connect with.
Thank you. I read many reviews of this book, in altre parole, in other words, and my general impression...
I've read none.
Pardon? Well, I've read loads. And my general impression is that many critics and readers are more sbalorditi, stunned, no? For lack of a better word, about the fact that you dared not to write in English, then absorbed in the content of your book. But at the same time, you continue to write in Italian, so this is not just a capriccio. And if I may, I would like to share something with our audience tonight. I just read a forthcoming short story, which I have here, and it's called Il confine, the border. Would you say the border? And I found it beautiful and heartbreaking on so many levels, and you and I were talking about it backstage. It's your next piece in Italian, and as I was reading it, I thought, this is Jhumpa Lahiri's voice. It just happens not to be in English. It has a universal tone. It explores issues that can relate to everyone, as critics often are fond of saying of your writing: family, loss, pain, happiness, poverty. But it is set in what I call a non-place and populated with characters with no names. They are more categorie. They are fathers, daughters, mothers, children, two women who quietly observe each other. So how does this relate to the rest of your body of work? Because I think it really does, in a new and exciting way. So would you like to say a few words about Il confine? Oh, can you also tell us when it's going to be published?
Well, it was published in Granta, Italia.
Oh, it's already out in Granta,
it came out in Granta, Italia in the fall. And then maybe it will be published in some other form at some point. But no, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, all of the fiction I've written in Italian has this abstract quality. You know, and I talk about it a little bit in the last piece of, in other words, the sort of the postface that I wrote almost a year after writing the book. I mean, this book, you know, it grew out of these questions. It grew out of many seeds, but in a sense, so the first thing I really wrote in Italian, apart from my diary, you know, was a short story, which is translated in the book called The Exchange, Lo Scambio. So that story I wrote very early on. It was in the fall, maybe November, in Rome. We moved in August. So, and then you know, ne sono rimasta molto sbalordita. I really was sort of stunned that I had written this thing in Italian without setting out to do it, without really saying to myself, let's see if I can write a story in Italian. It really wasn't like that. It was really just a moment of, it just came and I wrote it down. And almost, you know, I waited almost a year to start writing the first pieces of In Altre Parole, to understand how that story might have been born, right? And in that story, and in the last story in the book, which is called Penombra, Half-Light, and in this new story, Il Confine, all three of them share a lack of specificity in terms of place, first of all, and how can I say, identity, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the characters don't have names. The place is not articulated in so many words. And this approach for me is very liberating on a number of levels. I think I'm influenced clearly by some of the reading I've been doing in Italian. I know The Exchange, Lo Scambio, was written in a period when my teacher in Rome introduced me to the work of Manganelli. Oh. And so I was reading this amazing book of his, of 100 very, very short stories that he wrote. Extraordinary book, incredibly powerful, and all the stories, they're about a page and a half long, and they're all like this. You know, there was a man who wanted to, or, you know, there was a man who always, you know, stayed home on Thursday, kind of thing. And these are the conceits of the stories. And so I was reading these stories because, first of all, because they were so brief, and so I could really get into the language. And so the Lo Scambio, the exchange story, kind of grew out of that reading. And I just followed that, I think, unconsciously. Consciously, I followed that direction. Then this story, I think, was, the Il Confine came out of my discovery of Agota Christoph, who, with the trilogy of the La Città Kappa, of the City K, I mean, you see, it is set in a place in the world, but one doesn't know, right, exactly where it is. And I say that it's liberating for me because, you know, all of my writing, all of my life, my upbringing has been so severely marked. I mean, the trauma of the lack of a place is the kind of first, just at the base of my whole life, right? The absence of in the case of my family, the absence of Calcutta, the absence of India, but really the absence of a city of Calcutta, and this constant conflict between where we lived here in the United States, not far from here, and that other place that was the point of reference for my family, and trying to negotiate that vast distance, which in the 1970s really was profoundly vast and remains profoundly vast, but perhaps with certain developments in our world, there is a slighter sense of that, you know, the edge has been slightly taken off, maybe. But it was a very intense and painful experience for my family, right? And all of that, all of my writing is growing, reacting to this, and so much of my writing in the beginning, I look back on it now, I can say so much of my writing, I think, was the wish of a daughter to bring this place back to her parents somehow, to conjure that city, that place, and you know, my very first short stories were set in Calcutta, and a number of the stories in Interpretive Maladies are set in Calcutta, and then slowly I moved away from Calcutta, and I started writing about here, and I started writing about a little bit closer to perhaps my experiences, my generation's experiences, but Calcutta was always you know, a primary figure, and then my last novel, The Lowland, is very much, you know, partially set and born in Calcutta, right, and from experiences there, the history of that city. So I felt when I was, you know, finishing that book, The Lowland, I really just felt like I needed to go in a totally different direction, and it's strange, though I write in Italian now, and I love Italy, and you know, I'm very, very bound to my personal life there in Rome, but I don't feel like writing about that place specifically. I prefer to look at it through this filter, a more abstract, neutralizing filter, but I have the language. And that's more interesting to me. It's more interesting to me to work in Italian and describe what I'm seeing rather than say, we are in Piazza del Popolo and it looks like this. You know, I'd rather have that be vague and say, we're in the piazza, and it can be any piazza, but it's, I don't know, that interests me more right now.
And we discussed this just like this with my students in our seminar last week when we discussed your book, just about the fact that we are in Rome in so many pages of it, but Rome is not quite that much of a presence in there. But since you mentioned some authors that you are close to, some Italian authors, I would like to maybe mention another one, somebody I know you like, Elena Ferrante. And for those in the audience who are not familiar with Elena Ferrante's work, Ferrante is the pen name of a best-selling Italian author who for the past 24 years or so has remained completely mysterious. Nobody has ever seen her, no interviews, no photographs, just her books, starting with a 1992 very successful L'amore molesto. Help, because I don't know the titles in English.
Troubling Love.
Okay. Then I giorni dell'abbandono.
Days of Abandonment.
Thank you. La frantumaglia, which is probably
is now being translated, so we will see how she translates that.
And then La figlia oscura. Well, you know, many more.
I don't know how they translated that.
Until La spiaggia di notte, all the way to the greatly acclaimed saga, as I like to call it, of Lenuccia and Lila, from L'amica geniale, the
Storia di un nuovo...
Thank you, my brilliant friend, all the way to Storia della bambina perduta, which is the 4th volume. What I would really like to ask you, Jhumpa, is do you think that Lila killed Don Achille? But I will not ask you that question. Instead, I would like to ask you about Ferrante. And what do you think of her attitude towards her publications? About the fact that she lets her books promote themselves? Hers is a very unusual choice. Some people think it is a brave choice, especially today when everything we do is constantly documented online. And in your case, since the very beginning of your career, you have been a public person. People are familiar not only with your books, but also with your family history. And you are, I suppose, easily recognized. Your face is familiar to many. So your case and Ferrante's case are very, very different. So I'm sure that as much as it has its advantages, celebrity status is not always easy or welcome. So can you talk about the limitations of your fame, of being a celebrity author? How does it threaten your freedom as a writer? And if so, how do you defend yourself and your creativity, perhaps with an eye to Elena Ferrante? I hope I didn't put too much in this question.
No, I mean, you know, I did this omaggio. Did you know
yes,
this?
Okay, I know,
so I can
know,
explain.
But maybe not everybody here knows.
So, yeah, I mean, I started reading, before I moved to Rome, I read The Days of Abandonment in English, and this was the period in which Ombretta was saying at a certain point I stopped reading in English and I just started focusing on Italian. So it was really in that period I remember reading The Days of Abandonment in English, and it's published by a friend of mine, Michael Reynolds at Europa Editions, and I said, send this to me in English, send this to me in Italian now. And so he sent it to me the next day, and I read the whole book again immediately in Italian, and I think after that I just stopped reading in English everything. I haven't really read anything in English since then. So I read sort of everything and that I could at that time, and then the how do you say it? The tetralogy came out over time, and then after the first year in Rome, I was asked to present Elena Ferrante in Rome. I mean, how do you do that? How do you present an author who doesn't present herself? So I thought about it, and I thought, well, what can I say, and how can I say it? So I decided to write her 2 letters, because I felt that it was the only way I could really communicate with her, was to not to write an essay about her and to read it out loud, which would be more kind of talking to myself, but rather I really wanted to say something to her about my experience of reading her. But the first letter, was rather, it was not about her work, it was more about this choice that she has made to speak through her writing. And I wrote it in a time in which I was promoting my last book, and very unhappily so. I was, I found myself everywhere, talking about my book, reading from my book, and doing all the interviews, and et cetera, et cetera. And I found the experience so difficult, increasingly difficult, increasingly frustrating. And I remember I was in a hotel in Stockholm, in Sweden, and I thought of her, and I thought, she's so brave to have made this choice. And it's such a radical choice to make, right? But if you think about our world and how we live now, how we absorb culture, how we relate to each other, it is a very, it's a very strong and very, admirable choice in many ways, because, it is true that we are bringing, there is too much around the text now. There's just too much. I wrote another piece. I should have brought it for you, actually. I don't know if I sent it to you, this long lecture I wrote about, it's not a lecture, but on book covers, and my my constant battle with my book covers. And why is that? Because it's, when I first started reading, when I was a little girl, there were very few books in my house. My parents owned almost no books. They didn't read in English anyway. And my father's a librarian, and so he doesn't really believe in buying books. Not that you shouldn't buy books. You should all buy lots of books. And I buy lots of books. But I didn't grow up with a lot of books around, And but I went to the library all the time. I went to the public library, which was just down the street from our house. And I feel like when I look back sometimes I think about my life, and I think if it weren't for that, who knows what I would have done with my life. But the library was there, and I would go, and I would read so many books without any book covers. And I never knew what the author looked like. I never knew who they were. I didn't know Charles Dickens compared to, Stephen King. I mean, I really didn't know. I was just a child, and I was just reading these books, and often they just take the jackets off anyway in library books, which is beautiful. It's a beautiful thing, and I hunger for that now. When I was in Naples last month, there are so many wonderful used bookstores still in Napoli, and one morning I woke up. I said, I'm going to go browse in the bookstore alone, which is one of my most profound pleasures, is to go just rummaging through all those stalls. And I was so happy to open the books, which had no jackets, no covers. It was an old Einaudi volume of Luigi Malerba, okay? And I just opened it. There was nothing, just the cover, this greenish, grayish cover of the Einaudi hardcover, and the name and the words. And I read the first page or two, and I bought it. And I just felt freedom. I felt freedom from all of this stuff, and I thought, why isn't life like this anymore? Why are we inundated with so much information, and the pictures and the bios and the explanations and the YouTube millions of, I mean, it complicates the relationship. And so this is why I wrote to Elena Ferrante, saying, I admire what you've done. Having said that, I do feel oddly that her choice has become perversely a bizarre form of publicity.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yes, and her refusal to do this, right? Her refusal to come here, to see you, to say hello, to, participate in this dimension, arouses such intense curiosity that I think now the problem is, often I find myself, I've had so many conversations. Literally yesterday in New York, I went to a friend's house for dinner. And what did we talk about? We talked about Elena Ferrante, because everybody asks me all the time, do you know who she is? Do you know who she is? Do you know who she is? And so we talked about her, and I said, this is maybe, I don't know, like the 900th time I've talked about her, because I talk about her here, I talk about her in Rome, every Roman dinner party, people talking about her. But the issue now is, are you even reading her? Or are you just so kind of consumed by, but we have to find out who she is. But that's exactly it.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be asking that question. We should just realize that that's not part of the question. That's not the question.
Books.
That the book is the question.
Yeah.
And the question is, what do we think of the book?
Yeah.
And what are we getting out of the book? And what is the book doing? And have a relationship with the book. And I believe in that. I don't believe in, this book, my new book is, it's a very personal text. It grew out of a diary, and it's apart from 2 short stories, it is sort of a blatantly autobiographical work. And I'm struck during interviews when, someone will read a quote from the book, my book, and they'll read it, and they'll say then, and can you explain to me in your own words what you mean by that? So what is that telling us about what the book means now, and what the words mean?
Yeah.
Because, forgive me, but if this book were by somebody else and if I read it, I would not then ask the author, and could you please tell me in your own words what you mean by that? Because they are his own or her own words,
That's true.
It's a little...
Yeah. And actually, speaking of words that are in this book, throughout the tetralogy, Elena Ferrante uses a great word, smarginatura, right?
Which I talked about
in New York, right? With Anne Goldstein, that conversation. And I know you're very interested in this word, and you are interested in words in general, which is a good quality for a writer. This word is impossible to translate, and he gave her translator, and your translator to Anne Goldstein, a lot of headaches.
What does she use? Dissolving,
I think something like that, yeah. Do you have keywords in Italian that you consider special words? Are you building a Jhumpa Lahiri Italian lexicon that people will recognize as yours in the future? I noticed one word that I'd like to ask you about, and that's on page 20, and the word is sconnessura. When I read the book the first time, you wrote, parlo con un accento senza autorità, per cui ho sempre percepito una sconnessura tra me ed esso. I have an accent, I speak without authority, and so I've always perceived a disjunction between it and me. Disjunction is what Anne Goldstein picked. But I was underwhelmed, unsatisfied. So I went to the library, and I looked it up in my favorite dictionary, which is the Salvatore Battaglia. And this is what I found. Fessura, fenditura, crepa, which translates as cracks, as if in a wall, a fissure, which is much stronger than disjunction, which is more of an abstract. Sconnessura is a physical word. Do you remember how you chose this word, or do you have any other words that you want to share with us? What is interesting in this, the Battaglia only gives 4 examples of literary use of sconnessura. 3 of them are literal, and they are from Boito, De Pisis, and Fenoglio. Only 1 is figurative, like yours, and that is from Calvino, who actually delivered a Giamatti lecture in 1983 at Mount Holyoke. From the introduction to Una pietra sopra, the uses of literature. Do you remember how you found sconnessura? Or maybe you want to share, maybe I'm obsessing over this word, maybe you want to share other words.
I found it in the dictionary where I found all the words. That's not true. I find words in other sources, right? I find it through friends. I find them, I hear them on the street, on the train. But most of the words I find in books, in my reading, and also just from reading the dictionary. Not methodically, but I work with physical dictionaries, and And I really like that. I think the fact that I don't rely on online dictionaries has, I think, informed my, how do you say, my absorption of the language.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I have a setup, right? I mean, in Rome I had it, and now in New York I have it, and I feel like I have to, I have like my little area with all the dictionaries around me, and this is how I'm reading. And so when I look up something, I open to the physical page, and then I see the meaning, and then I see various other words, and there's this whole kind of experience, and then I have my little taccuino, which I think maybe it's actually backstage, but my little book where I list, this is my own personal lessico, right, of learning Italian. I'm on to my second one now, and I just write in words. And I noticed, one thing interesting, one moment where I felt like I was making the switch over was, in the beginning, certainly before I left the United States, I had my little book where I would write in the words, and they were all in English, right? It was like lists and lists and lists of Italian words, and I would write the definition in English.
Yeah.
And then at a certain point I went to Rome, and I realized I was writing all of the definitions in Italian. Oh. And this was when I realized I had gone from the bilingual dictionary in my head to the monolingual dictionary in my head. So for years, when I look up a word in Italian, I never write the definition in English anymore. I always write it in Italian. And this is a sign to me that my Italian at least has a kind of, like a base level, so that I can build on top of that. So I can write sconnessura and write next to it other definitions in Italian to help me understand the word more deeply. So that's how I found the word. But we talked about it because, all of the pieces were published in, first I would write them for my Italian teacher who was coming to the house every week, and I wrote these pieces once a week as kind of homework, self-imposed homework for him. So he was the first reader, and we would talk about it, and we would talk about every word. I mean, needless to say, he remains my teacher. But, and so he would, allora, sconnessura, cosa vuol dire? And so I said, well, I think this is what I want to say. And he would say, okay, ci sta, let's go, it's all right. And then I published each of the words in each of the pieces in this magazine called Internazionale, which ironically, so it's this news magazine, weekly news magazine published out of Rome, and it's a wonderful magazine, but what they do...
Probably the best magazine in Italy right now.
It's a great magazine, it's really, so the whole kind of, the project of Internazionale is that they excerpt articles from foreign media. So they run long articles from The New Yorker, from The Guardian, from The New York Times, from German publications, from French publications, from Le Monde. So they have this whole kind of, range of writing. And so everything that they publish is translated, except for these pieces. I mean, that's not true. They also have a couple of writers who write little pieces in Italian and reviews and things in Italian. But the bulk of what they run, the meat of what the magazine is it's a magazine entirely translated into Italian to bring the outside press, thoughts, ideas, discourse, debates, whatever, to Italians in Italian. So this magazine proposed to me when I was living there some collaboration, and I said, they didn't know that I was writing in Italian, nobody did, and they said, we know you're in Rome, and maybe you could write something about, I don't know, Rome, the traffic, something that, And I said, well, I don't want to write about the traffic, but I am writing about being in Rome in a more profound sense. I have these pieces I'm writing about. about language, about my relationship to Italian. And they said, okay, why don't you come and we can talk about this in person? I said, okay, I'll come and talk about it. And I brought them the first 3 pieces. And they read them, and they said, you know, we would like to run these pieces. What do you think? What's happening? I said, well, I think I'm just going to keep writing them, I think, for a while, if that's okay. And they said, okay. But so anyway, as a result, then one of the editors of Internazionale would come about once a month, and we would go over every piece, every word. And I remember sconessura was one of those words where he and I talked about it for a long time. And the thing is, he and the whole magazine and my teacher, my Italian teacher, I mean, I really owe this book to them, to those people, because they were the people. I mean, I was doing something completely insane. I was writing in Italian. You know, I was writing in a language I barely knew in some fundamental sense. I was doing something so kind of reckless and one could say irresponsible. And it is a great, great privilege to be able to do that. I will always be so profoundly grateful to them for allowing me to cross that line, because I'm not Italian. I had never, you know, I do not have a history of the language. I had not lived there for 20 years. You know, it wasn't like these other examples of other writers who have taken this step. It was something very premature, and one could say precocious, right? And I was aware of that, and they understood it. They understood it, and they understood what the nature of the experiment was. But if it weren't for them, if it weren't for people like them who would talk to me and say, tell me what you mean by sconessura, why do you want to use this word? And I would explain it to them, and then they would say, okay, it stays. Whereas, I mean, it wasn't always like that. Mm-hmm. There were many things we changed, and there were many things that, of course, I was inevitably getting horribly wrong. And, you know, my teacher would make the first cut and say, this isn't the right word, you know, non suona, non va bene, and I would understand, I would learn the mistake. And then also with Internazionale, because then it was for publication. So with my editors there was a much more, you know, the stakes were higher in that sense, because the pieces, they weren't just pieces between me and my teacher for pedagogical purposes. It was a piece that would be run in a magazine that would be published and read by, you know, un italiano chiunque. So it
my
had
parents
to
read Internazionale.
right. So it had to function. You know,
it would be read by my parents, for example. Yeah.
But the
Ordinary
fact that
people.
there are these words that Italian readers note and write me letters about, and you know, some readers, Italian readers, after the book came out in Italy, they would write me letters saying, okay, pagina 23, this word, I don't know, I don't like this word. Why did you choose this word? Oh yeah.
Wow.
And it was interesting, you know, it was interesting to hear those responses and to, I mean, it just deepens my understanding of language.
Yeah.
And not only this language, but of language and what it means to us as human beings, and it is perhaps the most intimate relationship we have.
Yeah. And actually, I think maybe we can now hear this language from Jhumpa Lahiri's voice and read something. But about everything you said, it was great that some of my students last week, how they remarked on the fact that they found your Italian to be delicate, very
well, that's
delicate.
A nice way.
Yeah, and I think it's true. In this book, the style is very delicate, and it doesn't always, I don't find that the English is always as delicate.
The translation.
The translation, yeah, of that. But before I ask you about that, maybe should we do a little reading?
Sure,
yeah?
Sure, okay.
So we're going to do something. So Jhumpa Lahiri is going to read in Italian, and then I'll read the English. And for those of you who actually have the book, we're reading the beginning of Il riparo fragile, The Fragile Shelter.
Tell me this page. Oh, here, I have it. Okay.
And it's
82.
82.
So I'll just read a page and a half of this, and then Ombretta will read the English. Il riparo fragile. Quando leggo in italiano mi sento un ospite, un viaggiatrice. Ciononostante quello che faccio sembra un compito ragionevole, accettabile. Quando scrivo in italiano mi sento un'intrusa, impostora, scusate. Sembra un compito contraffatto, innaturale. Mi accorgo di aver oltrepassato un confine. Ecco, that's the word that we're...
Yeah.
Di sentirmi persa, di essere in fuga, di essere completamente straniera. Quando rinuncio all'inglese rinuncio alla mia autorevolezza. Sono traballante anziché sicura, sono debole. Da dove viene l'impulso di allontanarmi dalla mia lingua dominante, la lingua da cui dipendo, da cui provengo come scrittrice, per darmi all'italiano? Prima di diventare un'autrice mi mancava un'identità chiara, nitida. È stato attraverso la scrittura che sono riuscita a sentirmi realizzata. Ma quando scrivo in italiano non mi sento così. Cosa vuol dire scrivere senza la propria autorevolezza? Posso definirmi un'autrice senza sentirmi autorevole? Com'è possibile, quando scrivo in italiano, che mi senta sia più libera, sia inchiodata, costretta? Forse perché in italiano ho la libertà di essere imperfetta. Come mai mi attrae questa nuova voce imperfetta, scarna? Come mai mi soddisfa la penuria? Cosa vuol dire rinunciare a un palazzo per abitare quasi per strada, sotto un riparo così fragile? Forse perché dal punto di vista creativo non c'è nulla di tanto pericoloso quanto la sicurezza. Mi chiedo quale sia il rapporto tra libertà e limitazioni. Mi chiedo come una prigione possa somigliare al paradiso. Mi viene in mente qualche riga di verga che ho scoperto di recente. Pensare che avrebbe potuto bastarmi quell'angolo di terra, uno spicchio di cielo, un vaso di fiori per godere tutte le felicità del mondo, se non avessi provato la libertà e se non mi sentissi in cuore la febbre roditrice di tutte le gioie che sono fuori di queste mura. Chi parla è la protagonista di Storia di una capinera, una novizia di clausura che si sente intrappolata nel convento, che vagheggia la campagna, la luce, l'aria. Io in questo momento preferisco il recinto. Quando scrivo in italiano mi basta quello spicchio di cielo.
The Fragile Shelter. When I read in Italian, I feel like a guest, a traveler. Nevertheless, what I'm doing seems a legitimate, acceptable task. When I write in Italian, I feel like an intruder, an imposter. The work seems counterfeit, unnatural. I realize that I've crossed over a boundary, that I feel lost, in flight. I'm a complete foreigner. When I give up English, I give up my authority. I'm shaky rather than secure. I'm weak. What is the source of the impulse to distance myself from my dominant language, the language that I depend on, that I come from as a writer, to devote myself to Italian? Before I became a writer, I lacked a clear, sharp identity. It was through writing that I was able to feel fulfilled. But when I write in Italian, I don't feel that. What does it mean for a writer to write without her own authority? Can I call myself an author if I don't feel authoritative? How is it possible that when I write in Italian, I feel both freer and confined, constricted? Maybe because in Italian, I have the freedom to be imperfect. Why does this imperfect, spare new voice attract me? Why does poverty satisfy me? What does it mean to give up a palace to live practically on the street in a shelter so fragile? Maybe because from the creative point of view, there is nothing so dangerous as security. I wonder what the relationship is between freedom and limits. I wonder how a prison can resemble paradise. I'm reminded of a passage in Verga, whom I recently discovered. To think that this patch of ground, a sliver of sky, a vase of flowers, might have been enough for me to enjoy all the happiness in the world if I hadn't experienced freedom, if I didn't feel in my heart a knowing fever for all the joys that are outside these walls. The speaker is the protagonist of La storia di una capinera, Sparrow, the story of a songbird, a novice in an enclosed order of nuns who feels trapped in the convent, who longs for the countryside, light, air. I, at the moment, prefer the enclosure. When I write in Italian, that sliver of sky is enough. I find that this is a very it's a very, very profound page that gives, I'm sure, readers a profound sense of what your book is about and of what your experience is about. And this is what we meant at the beginning when we said that this is a very, very personal essay and very honest as well. So as a last question before we take questions from our audience, I was wondering whether you could say 2 words about your experience with Anne Goldstein, your translator. Anne Goldstein translates quite a few Italian authors at the moment. She's,
including Elena Ferrante.
Yeah, including Elena Ferrante, of course. And in a recent interview, she said that, you know, in some sense, translating Ferrante was like translating a dead author because she's absent even with her translator. And then she said she worked with Baricco a little. That was frustrating for her. For one thing, because he was always rewriting, and for another, he often had his own ideas about the translation. How was your experience with Goldstein? Did you choose her? And if so, how did you choose her? And you talk extensively in your book about how you decided not to translate your book yourself. And those are very interesting pages in your book. But were there moments when you thought, avrei potuto far meglio io, I could have done a better job myself? Or, you know, as a closing thing, would you like to say anything about this?
Well, I don't think I could have translated this book into English when it needed to be translated.
And you explained the reasons very well.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think I was capable of it. And I explain it. You know, I can add that, I mean, the basic reason is that I, being aware of what my Italian is, did not want to basically do it the favor, if you will, of translating myself into English and improving it in the process. I did not want to do that.
Yeah.
I wanted the Italian to be just as it was, with all of its problems and all of its strangeness and all of its, you know, just what it is. It is what it is. It's my Italian, and I didn't want it to turn. I didn't want the English to sound more polished, more correct, more fluid. I did not want this to happen. I was very clear about that from the beginning, and so I, you know, I asked somebody else to do it. The translator was chosen by my editing, my publishing house, and my agent, Raffaella. I don't know if you know De Angelis. So she's my agent. So, you know, we sort of talked about it, and Anne Goldstein's name came up, and she was willing, and she did this, you know, very strange work of translating the Italian of a non-Italian writer, and so really I couldn't have done it. I know I couldn't have done it.
Did you leave her complete freedom?
Well, I mean, there were stages, So in the beginning, when the translation was finished about a year ago, last spring, and I was still in Rome, and I was aware that my time there was coming to an end, and I was, profoundly sad. I was just devastated about this, and I didn't want to face it, right? I didn't want to come back. And so reading my book in English was sort of this strange representation of the return. And I didn't want to face it. And so I made my husband read it. When the translation came. It came to our house, and I couldn't even open it. I said, ti tocca, Alberto. I just, non posso. And so he did. He was great, and he read it. And he took some notes. I mean, his Italian is pretty good, too. So
although you don't write that in your book.
Well, yeah. No, funziona. Yeah. So he read, and so anyway, he was reading in the English, right? Yeah. So, but he read it, and he said, "Look, this is what I think, and it's good, but you've got to face this, ti tocca."
Yeah.
And I said, "Okay, fine," and but I needed him to look at it first. I couldn't even touch it. And then one day I said, okay, I'm going to stop everything I'm doing, and I'm just going to go dedicate a week in the library. I'm going to go and I'm going to read it, and I'm just going to confront this thing. And it was very interesting because, I read it through, and it wasn't as strange as I thought. I remember I had an envelope like this made of paper. And on the back, I just made these long lists of words that were not what I would have translated, and they were almost all of them were adjectives. And so that taught me a lot about translation and language and writing.
And translation is something that you are very interested in.
Well, I'm
right?
translating something right now from Italian, which is another thing, but I was struck by the fact that the area in which I kept pausing and saying, well, maybe not that, maybe this, was all of the adjectives. Because with the grammar, it was basically, it was very clean. She knows what she's doing with the grammar. I mean, there were a couple of things, people get tired or they miss something or whatever. And then sometimes with the grammar, a translator will fiddle with the grammar a little bit, because languages are, in a sense, they're sort of just intolerant of one another, right? And so your translator has to manipulate and do things, and sometimes I would say, no, I want it to be in the conditional, even if it sounds a little bit off in the English or whatever it was. So I would, but it was mainly all the adjectives. And so I made these suggestions, I sent it back, and I just kind of said, it's fine, va bene così, I don't want to get into it. And then there was another part, there was a kind of chapter 2, which was in the fall. I was back in the United States, and I was asked to read the audio version of the book in both languages. Yeah. And it was a very intense process. It took a week, and I was, locked in the studio. I don't know if you read the little rubrica I wrote about this experience, but I was locked in this little recording studio, and I had a friend come from Rome. She kindly came to help me. She was there with the headphones on the whole time to, catch me every time I, made a pronunciation mistake or got the accent wrong or whatever. She was just there to spot me in the Italian, which I read, the whole text in Italian. And then immediately afterward, I read the whole text out loud in English. And that was the moment where I really suddenly I was really confronting the translation. Yeah. I was in that space, I was by myself, and I was reading both texts out loud, and I felt like that was really the moment where I kind of understood what I had done, And I think if I hadn't done that, the whole book would remain, there would be a kind of surreal I mean, there is still a kind of surreal haze around the whole book. It doesn't kind of fully feel real to me. The Italian feels like a miracle still, you know, and the English feels, I don't know, I mean, it's sort of the footnote to the miracle. It's like, you know, what is that? But when I read it in my own words, in Italian, realizing, really, I mean, if there's nothing like reading your own words out loud in another language to realize, I mean, I had my friend Sara there in the studio to tell me, you know, si dice così, you know, and I knew in that moment that I will always be a student of this language. I can never get to the other side. I can try. I can kind of get there, you know, I can get close, but I can't ever be there, you know, without her reminding me, telling me, correcting me, you know, like this. And then when I read the English, clearly they are not my words, right? They're the translator's words. But they come from my words, so I feel another relationship to them, also very, what is the word? Not direct, right? So that was very interesting, that experience, and that was when I did the bulk of the changes, and I've changed, you know, I'm not radically, but suddenly I had a whole big email saying, and it was at the, you know, ultimo momento, and I was just like, is there time? And suddenly I got very, you know, is there time? Because I really want these to be like this.
Yeah.
But also I think I needed to come back to the United States to even, my whole English-speaking part of my brain was just kind of in a voluntary coma, you know, for years. I didn't want to work in English, and I just avoided it. And so the English translation wasn't really registering to me when I was there.
Until I came back to the United States, and I had to physically articulate every word in English, and suddenly I thought, okay, this is what is happening in English, and if it's going to be happening in English, I would like it to happen this way, without refining it. I never polished the translation. I just, you know, but there were certain word choices that didn't feel, that at that point I said, well, I wouldn't, avrei potuto, you know, fare
fare meglio, because this is not what I would have done. But you know, the final thing I will say on this is, you know, I have a good friend in Rome. Her name is Francesca Marciano, and she is Italian. She's Italian. And she's written many books, and she writes in English. So she kind of does the opposite of what I do, but I think with far greater authority, in that she lived many years in New York. She lived many years in Africa. So she, you know, she has lots and lots and lots and lots of English miles behind her. But anyway, we are very close friends, and in a way, it was her example. You know, I don't know, I mean, many things, but anyway, when I started writing in Italian, I mean, she was the first person I told her the secret. I said, Francesca, sto scrivendo in italiano. Is this, what am I doing? And she said, just do it, just see where it goes, you know. And, but she's an interesting case because, so she writes in English, and when her book was translated into Italian last year, she was heavily, heavily, heavily involved in the translation. And she got really into it, and she got, you know, she basically rewrote the book. And so when my book had to be translated, she said, you know, Jhumpa, you should really, you know, I said, I don't feel like it, I don't want to deal with it. And she said, you really should, look, you know, it's an opportunity for you to make it better, to correct things. I said, I don't want to do those things. I don't want to make it better. I just want it to be what it is. And then I explained to her one day why. I said, you know, my whole life, everything has been this kind of fused state. It's like I'm never this or that, I'm both of these things in some strange combination, some hybrid form, right? I'm not American, but I'm not Indian, but I'm kind of this, but I'm not exactly that, and there's, you know, whatever I am, there's this other piece of me over there, and this has to be negotiated all the time. And I feel that in language, at least with this book, by simply writing it in Italian, and not really touching the English, apart from with a very kind of light hand, I allow my Italian to just remain what it is, without the English kind of, intersecting and creating that. Do you see what I'm saying? Because if I were to translate it into English, then suddenly the Italian and the English would meet.
Yeah.
My Italian and my English would meet. And I feel that this is one instance, something I can control. This is one instance in my creative life, at least, that I can maintain this confine, this border, which we talked about tonight, and which I do think is kind of one of these, parole chiavi for me, because it's like at the center of what I'm doing with this confine between me and other languages, between me and other cultures, however you want to look at it. My sense is that identity itself is a kind of confine, and I want to get beyond it. And I want to get on the other side of it, and I want to and see what that's like. And I think some of this fiction is this impulse to get beyond that.
Yeah.
Well,
all of these feelings I find that you describe very well in your book, and I've had several students who were so moved when they read this book that they cried because they felt vindicated in their own experience, personal experiences. So that is a wonderful thing that you did. But now we have a few minutes to take some questions. I'm sure there'll be many. We can't take them all. Jhumpa Lahiri. So we have two great volunteers with microphones. Make sure the microphones are on.
Yeah.
Melanie.
Yeah. Hi. My question is really about identity. I feel very strongly that...
Melanie, can you be a little louder, because the people who are leaving are making a lot of noise. So.
I feel very strongly that language is a type of identity, and I wondered what it says about your own identity that you chose to write this autobiographical work, your first in Italian rather than in English or Bengali.
Well, I think that identity is language, and vice versa. I think, that is, if you boil down what identity is, I believe it is language. I don't think there's anything beyond that. I think we can do so many things to play with identity, and we do. But I think when you start to change your linguistic identity, that is a very radical operation, right? Especially if you are writing in the other language, and especially if it's the kind of writing that's coming out of a desire and not a need to just kind of, you have to do it, so you do it, and doesn't make it any easier, but it's another kind of relationship. But if you have a kind of desire, if you look at the first sentence of that story I wrote, Lo Scambio, it's about a translator, first of all. And the first sentence is, there was a translator who always wanted to be another person. So that's me, right? Even though I hadn't really ever translated anything formally in my life before, but I have felt like a translator my entire life. Yeah. I've never been able to live in one language. I don't know what that's like. And so I think that it's actually makes sense that I would write an autobiographical work in another language in which I feel free from identity, perversely. I feel free from it. I feel like I can just put it to the side and speak for myself using Italian. This is why my relationship to Italian is so profound. Not only is it now the language, I think, of happiness, what I talked about last week in the embassy, it is the language in which I feel a sort of pure happiness for the first time in my life, because it is the language of, I have bad days in Italian, and I have quarrels in Italian and stuff happens in Italian that's not always, happy. But it is, aside from, stepping aside from those details, it is the language of joy for me. It brings me a joy that I don't feel in the other languages. This is true, and I recognize that, and I think, there's so many ways to look at. Yes, it's a book about myself written in a language which is for me a kind of mask, right? Mm-hmm. Italian gives me a sort of, it gives me a sort of protection. Because it's not, I always think of it as a language in prestito. It's not mine, it's borrowed. It's a borrowed language, and I have to be very careful with it. But it's also, because I don't possess it, because it's a borrowed language, it's because it's like those library books I used to borrow when I was a kid. Those library books changed my life. I had no other books. Nobody bought me any books, I'm not saying this to feel, but this was just the reality. These were borrowed books. And in a borrowed language, in a sense, because it wasn't the language I spoke at home. It wasn't the language I, was connected to emotionally as a young person at all. And yet that changed my life. That relationship changed my life, going to the library, reading books in English. And I think similarly, learning Italian as an adult, this borrowed language, the relationship I have with it, which is, one of love, but one of fear and anxiety and disagio, of discomfort. It's the language of it. That's one of the inherent contradictions of the whole experiment, is that it is the language of joy and of comfort and I'm sort of seeking a mother tongue, right? Which is now a concept that I've come to realize doesn't exist for me. But I am a writer without a real mother tongue, and I think learning Italian made all of this very clear. It was moving to Rome and starting to think and write in Italian when I realized I have no direct, pure relationship to any language in my life. I don't have it with Bengali. I couldn't have written the book in Bengali. I don't even know how to write in it. I don't even have that capacity. It's another. I have a different relationship to Bengali completely. Intimate but oral and deeply imperfect. And then I have a different relationship to English, which is maybe technically more capable, but with all of these vast pockets of distance and sconesura with English, right? And needless to say, with Italian, I have other issues, other problems, other limitations, other, etc. So, but it's this search for a home, right? It's a search for a linguistic home, una lingua madre, all of these things, which I was searching for all my life. I felt the lack of these things all my life. And it's only when I get into Italian that I'm able to stop the search. Now I don't look for it anymore. Now I just develop the different relationships, right? So right now my energy is going into developing the relationship with Italian. But I know that I don't have any illusions about it. It's not my mother tongue. It will never be my home. That's crazy. And I'm old enough to know it. I think whereas when I was younger, I wanted to have a real relationship with Bengali. I wanted to be able to speak it like my parents spoke it. I couldn't. And so then this feeling of imperfection, which marks me. And then I wanted to be fully American. And even though I spoke English well and I read in it and I wrote it and everything, but I couldn't have a full relationship with that language, because you cannot have a relationship with a language without feeling that connection to the culture. If you don't have the relationship with the culture, then there's this. This.
And you feel you have this. I really am mindful of the audience, and I'd like for them to ask you for some questions. But you feel you have this connection with the culture now.
Which connection?
Well, with Italian that allows you this freedom.
Yes.
A lot of hands. I don't know. It's hard for us to see. Yeah, please.
Hi. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming. It's an honor to see somebody I have grown up reading talk about her experiences, and it's really, I was choking at some point when you were talking about identity. And I find it incredibly intriguing that you chose to write a novel in a language that you say that you will always be studying and on the other side of. So my question is, how did you know when you were done writing this book?
It's not a novel.
Well, it's not a novel. It's actually just
Sorry, autobiography.
it's reflections, brief reflections, and 2 short stories. That's what the book is. It's not a novel. I would, I dream now to write maybe a very, very short novel in Italian one day. Maybe it's possible. Maybe it will never happen. I don't have any presumptions about this. So the question is, how did I know when it was done?
And how did you choose, right? But there is a great place where you explain that you didn't choose.
Well, no writer chooses anything. We have no power, we have no control over it. I mean, no, but this is true, there's a very beautiful book by Vargas Llosa, a series of letters he wrote. It's called Letters to a Young Aspiring Novelist, something like that. I read it in Italian, but he talks about the writer actually, the freedom we have as writers is to manipulate reality. Yeah. And that is a great freedom. That is an extraordinary power. But what we don't have the freedom to do is to choose the themes. We don't have the freedom to choose our demons, is what he's saying. We don't have the freedom to choose our demons. We're born with our demons, right? And so my demon is all of this stuff, identity, language, where's my mother tongue, where do I belong, why do I have no home, why do I have no country, what do I call myself, all of these questions that have tormented me my whole life. I didn't choose those themes. They were given to me. I was born into this world with these circumstances. And as a writer, I have responded to those things. What I've done in the books, how I've manipulated that reality is in my control. But that's all that's in my control. So I didn't choose to write this book. I didn't choose, in that sense, there is, I do maintain that writing is a need, it's not a choice. You write because you have to, not because you want to. You have to do it. You can't live. If you don't do it, you're not living, and maybe you can't live. So it's sort of an act of survival.
You do say I write to save myself, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's the truth, and so. But the book was done because, as I explained, I was writing these weekly columns, and at a certain point, I felt I had said what I needed to say in that arc of, and I knew I was writing in another language, and I was aware of what sort of this gross risk and step I was taking, and I didn't want it to be going on, and I just wanted it to be misurato. I didn't want it to be a big thing. I didn't want it to. I felt that it had its, it had a certain proportion that it needed to maintain, and a brevity, and so it was clear to me when I reached the last chapter. Well, that's the end, and then maybe I can write something else, but that's it for this project.
I think we have time for one more. Yes, I think definitely one more. If you're asking questions tomorrow, perhaps not today. That's all I'm asking.
Sorry. One strange thing about places and things, I bought this evening the lowland also because I was born in the lowland and my father came from there and my father was a doctor. That's why I bought the Interpreter of Maladies at some point, and here I open it. And I read, lascia che io torni al mio paese sepolto nell'erba come in un mare caldo e pesante. let me return to my hometown entombed in the grass as in a warm and high sea. And these are actually lines by Giorgio Bassani, the writer from Ferrara, and the poem is Saluto a Roma. So there is this kind of distance. I would like to ask you, considering precisely these themes, what was your relationship with Italian literature, with the authors that you read, with the authors that you cherished?
Well, thank you for your question. That
was also one of mine.
That was an amazing, I mean, the origin of that citation, the epigraph, is really amazing, I think. I mean, I was in Wellfleet, where I was finishing the writing of the Lowland, and it was the summer before we left for Rome, just a month or two before we left for Rome. And I'd already started this Italian reading discipline, right, the rinuncia that I talk about in the book, the renunciation of the reading of English. And yet, what was I doing? I was trying to finish a novel that I had been working on for years and years in English. So, you know, per forza, I had to be in English too. But so I had this ritual in the morning, and I would wake up, and I would read Italian poetry, and then I would start writing in English. And I thought it was better to read poetry because the prose is, you know, I just thought, I'm going to wake up, I'm going to read, 20 minutes, I'm going to read some poetry, and I'm going to go back into the book, which was basically already written at that point, but I was refining and editing and blah, blah, blah. And so one day I found this Bassani poem, and I thought, this is incredible. I'm having a kind of out-of-body experience, because not only is the image of those lines something in my book, there's a kind of central scene in the book which is captured by those lines, right? By that grass. I was working in a house, in a studio, in which the landscape around that house of this overgrown grass had triggered a memory that I had had when I was a very young girl of actually coming back from India and finding, at the end of the one summer, and our house was kind of buried by this overgrown grass. And so being in that house in Wellfleet triggered the memory of that, and then I wove that into the book. But then I found this Italian poem by Bassani in which he basically has already written this beautiful poem about that very image and what it means. And it was called Saluto a Roma, which was a city I was about to go to. And so I just thought, this is one of those serendipitous moments of life. And so that was that's the explanation behind that the epigraph of the book. But you asked me about my reading. I mean, the whole project grows out of reading. All of my writing grows out of reading, and writing is nothing but a form of reading, right? Of reading to an extreme degree where you can't really contain yourself anymore, and you respond somehow, I think, to the reading through writing. This is my sense of what I do. And it's certainly what I'm doing in Italian, because, I have this formal renunciation of reading in English that brings me to Rome. I'm reading in Italian, I start reading, and then in Rome it's like a candy store, because here it's like, okay, I'd read Moravia, Pavese, Ferrante, other people. I'd never even heard of Bassani until I found him in this anthology. And then I went to Rome, and I was like, so what about Bassani? And people were like, Bassani, immenso, grande. And then I read, plus I could go into all of the bookstores and just buy books and read them, and it was, incredible, just this whole reawakening and becoming a reader again, in another language has been one of the greatest joys of my life.
And Giorgio Bassani, for those of you who may not know, his most famous novel is The Garden of the Finzi Continis, which is an absolute masterpiece amongst other masterpieces he wrote. Do we have time for one more? Can you take one more question, and then we're done? Quick and loud. Yes, whoever you are.
Hello. Whoa. So you were talking about, the intersection of identities and how different emotions can play out in different languages, which made me curious just from my own experience of studying languages, specifically for me, Spanish. Are there any specific words or phrases in Italian that you felt, expressed your experiences or really touched your emotions in a way that maybe English or Bengali hadn't? And if so, what might those phrases or words be?
Well, I mean, this might sound kind of strange, and it is because it's kind of ridiculous, but what I'm going to say, but I think part of the reason I had this connection with Italian and is that contrary to fact, Italian does not strike me as a foreign language. It seems to me the natural language, as ridiculous as that sounds. But when I went to Florence, the moment I describe in the book, when I really heard Italian for the first time around me.
And you were an undergraduate student, right?
I was a graduate student.
You were a graduate student.
I was maybe 25 or so, but I had never really heard Italian really before. I mean, I had no Italian friends. I had seen some Italian movies, but that was my contact, shall we say, with Italian as a language, as a spoken language, something that I was hearing. But when I went to Florence, I had this experience where I felt that, well, this is the way everything should be said. Dovrebbe essere così. And this is a very weird feeling to have because, of course, it was a foreign language, but I don't think of it that way, and I can't call it that in my head, in my heart. I can't call it a foreign language. It pains me somehow. But it's another language, right? And I don't know, I can't explain that. It's a very irrational thing. But I feel that about Italian, and I felt that, and I still feel that. And the more I know it, the more I study it, the more I, live in it and think in it, etc. I feel a sort of peace about it. And in a strange way, I think with Bengali, because it was my first language, Bengali also has this kind of comforting sense, even though it's my weakest language, right? I mean, it is by far my weakest language, and I would not have been able to talk to you today about these things in Bengali in an intelligent way. But it has its place in my life, and it allows me to communicate and express things to certain people with whom I only communicate in that language, relationships that have marked me and made me who I am. So it has a place of deep significance in my life. Whereas English is my strongest language, but it remains the most foreign language. And I can't explain it, but this is how it is. So that's how it is with Italian. I feel a kind of, I don't know, when I work in it, I'm translating a novel now, not my own. I'm translating a novel by Domenico Sternone.
Rumored to be Elena Ferrante.
But not.
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
He is my friend, and he would kill me if I, furthered this rumor any more than it's already, gone all out of control. But this is my project at the moment. I'm translating his novel, and I mean, it's incredible. It's an incredible process, challenging for me, new. But what I love most about it is that, it's just taking me deeper into the Italian. And I think that this is maybe unusual for a translator, because, and this is why, because I think English never had that emotional base,
Yeah.
you know, even though it's the English in which I speak to my children. I love my children in English, you know, it's the language I speak to with my husband. So I have many deep, fulfilling, intimate, profound relationships in English, but it was the learned language. It was the outside language. It was the language outside of my house that didn't belong to my family.
Yeah.
And I will never be able to not recognize that in some sense, you know. But these are very strange, emotional, mysterious things, I think, and that's
they're
why.
mysterious, but I don't think they're strange for
Well,
many.
maybe not.
Not
but
for
that's,
everybody.
But that's why I do think that, you know, I think language is the most intimate thing the most intimate relationship we have is with
Yeah.
language. That's how, I mean, even beyond people, I think the relationships we have to language, and that's why people, I think, react to this book as strongly as they do, because it triggers all of these strange reactions people have, like, you know, the people who don't like what I'm doing. For them, it's sort of deeply offensive. You know, how can you do that? Why would you do that? This is wrong. There's something perverse about, there's something wrong about this. And you know, they're entitled to their opinion. But it triggers these, you know, it's a kind of primordial response almost.
Yeah.
You know, and I think language has that dimension, you know, certainly the anthropology of language and
The
politics of language, and you know, I mean, it's so layered and so complex a subject. Needless to say, we can't possibly, you know, explain it all tonight, but that's how I feel, yeah.
Well, thank you. That's all I can say. It was wonderful. And thank you all for coming tonight. This was a very, very personal conversation. It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night. Buonanotte.